I would just remind people to keep your video and audio off, muted, until we get to the audience portion of the our seminar, because otherwise we won't be able to see all the speakers front and foremost. So let me just fix one more thing. Okay, so I'm Catherine Ewing, the director of the South Asia Institute here at Columbia University. And I'm really delighted to welcome you all to today's panel discussion with Manan Ahmed on his new book, The Loss of Hindustan, The Invention of India, which was recently published by Harvard University Press. Our event today is co-sponsored by the Committee on Global Thoughts, the Heyman Center for the Humanities, and the Institute for Social and Economic Research Policy. I would also like to welcome our three panelists, Vishakha Desai, who's the chair on the Committee on Global Thought at Columbia, Purnima Dhavan, who's in history at the University of Washington, and Aisha Ramachandran, who's in comparative literature at Yale University. So I'm going to begin by briefly introducing our speakers, and then I'll give you a sense of the timetable, and then people can take it away. Manan Ahmed is associate professor in the history department at Columbia. He's a historian of South Asia and the littoral Western Indian Ocean world, the littoral Indian Ocean world from 1000 to 1800 of the Common Era. His areas of specialization include intellectual history in South and Southeast Asia, critical philosophy of history, colonial and anti-colonial thought, and a range of other related topics. He's interested in how modern and pre-modern historical narratives create understandings of places, communities, and intellectual genealogies for their readers. He's one of the lead faculty in two major international research projects at Columbia: Decolonization, the Disciplines and the University, which began in 2019 and will continue through 2023, that is funded by the Mellon Foundation, and Muslims in India from 2020 to also to 2023, that is funded by the Luce Foundation. His earlier books include a book from 2011, Where the Wild Frontiers Are, Pakistan and the American Imagination, and a book of conquest, Chashnama and Muslim Origins in South Asia, published by Harvard in 2016, which is on the intellectual life of an early 13th century Persian history of the conquest of Sind. So we'll see, he discusses the intellectual life of this object, basically. Purnima Dhavan is associate professor of history at the University of Washington. Her research interests include the social and cultural history of early modern South Asia from 1500 to 1800, examining how religious, linguistic, and status identities shaped Mughal political and cultural institutions. Her first book, When Sparrows Became Hawks, The Making of Khalsa Martial Tradition, examined the transformation of North Indian peasants into high-status warriors as they became members of the Sikh warrior order. Her second book project, The Lords of the Pen, Literary Associations in Early Modern South Asia, examines the literary activities of poets in emerging urban centers of the Mughal Empire to understand how participation in literary associations shaped understandings of caste, gender, and religious identity. Aisha Ramachandran is Associate Professor of Comparative Literature at Yale University. Her broad-ranging interests encompass early modern literature and cultural history and Europe's relations with the Indo-Islamic world. Her prize-winning first book, The World Makers, published by the University of Chicago Press in 2015, charts transnational encounters and the early mechanisms of globalization from the late 15th to the early 18th centuries. Her current book project, Lyric Thinking, Humanism, Selfhood, Modernity, argues for the central importance of lyric form and language in shaping new intellectual possibilities for the self in the early modern period and beyond. Dr. Vishakha Desai is chair of the Committee on Global Thought at Columbia and senior advisor for global affairs to the president of Columbia University. She's also a senior research scholar for the School of International and Political Affairs at Columbia and serves as senior advisor for global programs to the Solomon R. Guggenheim Foundation. From 2004 to 2012, Dr. Desai served as president and CEO of the Asia Society, a global organization dedicated to strengthening partnerships between Asia and the US. And I'll mention this other thing, that in 2012, President Barack Obama appointed her to serve on the National Museum and Library Services Board. An internationally renowned scholar of Asian art, she has published and lectured extensively on the intersection of traditional and contemporary arts and policy in diverse countries of Asia. Her most recent book, forthcoming this year, is World as Family, a journey of multi-rooted belongings, which sounds like it's going in a slightly different direction from much of the other things that you've done. So Professor Ahmed and our three panelists will each speak for about 10 minutes. Then there'll be a discussion amongst the panelists, followed by questions from our audience. So I just remind everybody to stay on mute and with video off until we get to the audience questions and answers, when people can. I don't know if we have an exact, I assume you raise your hand for, well, we'll worry about that when we get there. Anyway, please join me in welcoming Professor Ahmed and our three panelists.
Thank you, Kathy. So I think the order is that I go first, right? And then we'll okay. So I want to just thank you. First of all, thank you all for being here virtually and in spirit as well. I'm really delighted and honored that you've chosen to spend your morning / afternoon / evening, as the case may be, to think about this book and be here. I want to start off by thanking some of the people that Kathy has mentioned already, but just from the debt that I have from these institutions at Columbia and elsewhere in the kind of intellectual making of this project. Heyman Center, who's a co-sponsor, I was a fellow there, and the book really began in many forms in that fellowship. And I thank Eileen Gillooly. I want to thank IRCPL and ISERP and the Committee on Global Thought, who have been important members of our intellectual world here at Columbia and have been people that I've learned from and who have supported my scholarship in many ways over the last 7 or 8 years. So my gratitude to them for co-sponsoring. Of course, my home institution, my home department, history department, which is an incredible array of scholars who teach every day by example and by their own work how to be a historian, and I'm doubly grateful for their presence and their support. I want to thank also the South Asia Institute, which is directed by Professor Catherine Ewing, which has sponsored this and put this panel together, and Bill Carrick for doing all of the work that he does so exemplary in keeping the South Asia Center running and for doing all the work to put this together today. So I thought that given that everyone who's here has already read the book and has questions, I thought I'd maybe say something about my journey to this book and of course some of the things that are that was a joke. I know it lands very badly on Zoom, but I know that many have not read the book, but maybe this will convince you. So this book, The Loss of Hindustan, Invention of India, actually began a few years ago as a comparative project. I was very interested in thinking about the histories of arrivals that we are quite familiar with, especially in the arrivals in Virginia and as well as the arrivals in the Western Ghat, in Calicut and Madras in the Deccan. And part of my impetus was to kind of think about the early modern from a vantage point of the globe, looking through some of the histories that I was kind of exploring in coming in Persian. And so I began thinking about this project while reading and learning from Latin Americanists and the scholarship on the conquest of New Spain, quote unquote, as well as the colonies in Virginia, and thinking about how history writing comes under stress under these colonial erasures of people's traditions and languages. And so Firishta was one of the tools that I thought I would have as a history in order to think about this this project in a broader sense. And I took Firishta with me while teaching in Mexico City, and kind of read Firishta while being in Oaxaca and while being in Mexico, thinking about some of the sites of conquest and erasure that are littered there. And as my kind of engagement with the historiography deepened, I began to understand also the burden of thinking about a philosophy of history itself on my project. How do we write history? What do we say is the driving force of history? How does history writing propel us to a deeper understanding of community or belonging? And the effort to investigate, let's just call it the footnotes of the philosophy of history, became a major kind of engine for me to think with. And I started to look for, really with Firishta, I started to look for ways in which his citation entered in the writings of figures like Hume, Kant, and then Herder and Hegel and Schilling later on. And as I began to kind of think about these founding documents of the philosophy of history that continue to organize much of the way we continue to understand what philosophy of history is, how do you make space for a document such as Firishta's history and the philosophy that may have been motivating him and how he may have approached the subject of history writing? It was at that point in my project where I was starting to articulate something about what a decolonial philosophy of history might seem like, that I actually turned my attention fully kind of away from the comparatives to this idea of Hindustan, because I thought that if concept history of this word would allow me to actually think about both the kind of philosophy of history component, but also the ways in which history writing has itself a history within the subcontinent that deserves to be reinvigorated or re-enlivened, I guess, among other things. And so that's kind of the journey that the project took in order to kind of think about what I was doing, which is writing a history of the concept of Hindustan as it has operated in the field of history writing itself. And as any concept history, what I had to do start right away was try to build, really rigid boundaries that I wasn't going to cross in the making of my archive, I guess. So Hindustan, which is a concept for a territory, but is also can be understood to represent a cultural ethos. It could be understood to represent a dance practice. It could be used in the ways in which cuisine and textile are part of our daily lives in the subcontinent around the world. I wanted to make sure that my book doesn't go in all of those directions, architecture and visual arts being other incredibly important archives, but to keep at this history of historians who are writing about Hindustan or writing about the philosophy of history. And with that kind of delimitation, the book treats Firishta, who was a 17th century, late 16th, early 17th century historian who writes what I argue in the book to be the first synthetic history or the first comprehensive history of the subcontinent as a space. And in writing this history, Firishta is very much aware of the archive of historians that he is accessing. He's very much aware of the library that he has access to and upon which he's building his own perspective. And he's also very much aware of the presence of Europeans and what the presence and their commercial and their military designs have to do with the world that he was constructing, the world of Hindustan that he was constructing. And in that moment of precarious balance that this book, that Firishta's time period is, and that this book kind of takes as its core, I see both possibilities and ends that happen. And so one of the contradictions, or one of the competing forces the book traces from that period of early 17th century is the making of what first becomes Mughal India, then becomes Mohammedan India, and then becomes British India, from which we, in 1947, emerge with the Republic of India and the Islamic Republic of Pakistan. And those countervailing forces, those tendencies of thinking about space, thinking about geography, but really thinking about people and thinking about ideas of kind of belonging, those two countervailing forces I tried to demonstrate in the book are central to the project of history writing itself. So history writing is not something that's happening at the margins of a political or an economic transformation or even another technical transformation, but rather history writing is at the center of it. It's driving the engine for the narration of the past. And very recently, other historians, Priya Satya, for example, has kind of made an argument along those same lines for British historians. But in my perspective, this notion of what I call the soldier scribes, their idea of history writing, and what they do by rendering texts from Persian and Sanskrit and other languages into English and Dutch and French and German, that project entailed a type of erasure of concept histories, as well as I mentioned earlier, erasures of people's life worlds and narrative paths. So the book does not treat this in a chronological matter. It does not treat this in a biographical matter. It is rather trying to address this history through a thematic lens. So my substantive chapters basically look at Hindustan as an archive, as in what is the history of historians who are writing about Hindustan. Hindustan as a place, as a space, as a geography, as a environment through which you can travel and which you can live in or are found in, languages, etc. And then Hindustan as peopled by different types of communities and what their relationship is to each other. And with these kinds of in these chapters, I try to foreground, in fact, European colonial efforts to narrate and to dominate and to render. And I do this really to make sure that the burden of a post-colonized historian that I have argued elsewhere is not simply to jump over the European past into the medieval history and think about it as it's distended from the colonial episteme or from the colonial reality. So the book tries to methodologically make clear in its own writing, or I try to do it in the book being not a sentient object, as I tell my students all the time, so it can't be a subject. So I tried to do in the writing of the chapters to foreground discursively, to narratively foreground the European, the voices of the Persian histories and Sanskrit and Hindi, Sanskrit and Deccan histories and poetry, and then also Firishta himself. And the book ends with, I want to just conclude now, the book ends with a moment in the 1920s and 30s where a number of historians who are generally called nationalists because they're in the nationalist period, as in there, but should really be, we should be calling the nationalists the anti-colonial period, because that's what they were doing. They were writing against the colonial states in various ways, even if they were part of universities that were colonial institutions. But the anti-colonial historians of the 1920s and 30s took on this project of the medieval history and did, I think, an incredible job, not only to re-question what the colonial histories were telling them about their own past, but also to look to the future, to predict the dichotomy between Hindus and Muslims that was had emerged by then, and that was going to dominate the 20th century that was to come before them. And the ethical burden of these historians, the burden for them to recognize their work as a critique of a type of bifurcation that they understood to be false or bore false promises, was something that I felt has been missing from our contemporary conversations about the role of the historian. And while the book ends in the 1920s, and I'm not a historian of the modern period, and I do not go further than that, I think I do find myself as a historian, as all of us do in this moment of COVID, in this moment of climate crisis, in this moment of majoritarian politics, reflecting about the charge that we face as historians in thinking and writing about the past that we do in whatever specializations we do, and what are the consequences for us in our own investigations of the past. And in ruminating on these historians of the 1920s and 30s, I found myself really moved by their conviction that their scholarship had a role to play and that their scholarship was important, even as they were confronting, as I said, colonial empire and a fascist present. So I'll stop with that, and I'm so very grateful and thankful to Professor Ramachandran and Dhavan and Desai and Desai for the comments that they have produced and will produce for us today, and I remain in your debt. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Ahmed. Our next speaker, I'm hoping, is the internet is working okay. Professor Dhavan is scheduled to speak next. Are you with us? So maybe we should turn to Professor Ramachandran next. Would that be okay? And then
no, I think Professor Dhavan is with us. I see her.
Oh, you do? Sorry.
That's fine. It's a pleasure to have so many people on the screen. Being lost in this crowd is indeed an honor. Let me begin by congratulating Manan on a book that does what many of us have wished we could do and never quite succeeded in doing, which is to fully capture the textures, the connections, the resonances, the nuances, but indeed even the haunting silences of the text we work with, and bring some of the experience of reading them and the rich encounters one has as a reader to an audience that may not be always able to read them in the original languages, but surely after reading Manan's books, will come away with some of the interconnectivity, the flights of imaginations, and the very real grounding of lived experience that these texts bring to us. I wanted to take a slightly different approach in talking about the loss of Hindustan. What strikes me on reading the book, and I've been mulling over this for a while now, since it was many months before and I picked up the first draft of the book, and now to read it in its final version helps me see the completeness of the project a little bit better, is to focus on what I think is the key intellectual methodology that it brings to the attention of people from a very wide interdisciplinary readership, which is to take the intellectual agendas of the pre-colonial non-European past seriously. In other words, Firishta is a very dominant voice in this book, but so is his methodology. And in trying to understand the ways in which Firishta, as well as the associated so-called soldier scribes, and the different kinds of temporal and past-based narratives that Firishta was working with, to the attention of how it actually plays a major job in the actual narrative that he creates, I think is a huge achievement. Because in a sense, these methodologies, these intellectual agendas have rarely been taken as seriously even by contemporary historians today. We dissect them, we analyze them, we critique them, but to actually use them as an intellectual tool is rare. So I want to structure my comments around three important nodes that I think are an important way to think about how to make this practice actually useful in the postmodern. So I'm going to begin with a concept that anybody who reads Persian or Urdu poetry is probably familiar with, which is mani afrini, meaning making. And indeed, what history does, although it is sometimes written in prose, I would argue, though history can be poetic and often engages with poetry, is to bring a certain kind of meaning making to the study of the past. And this is rather different from the colonial trend or even modern rationalist trends of academic history, which always attempt to order narratives into arguments. And I'm guilty of this also, as are probably many of our colleagues in this audience who've had to correct undergraduate history papers and come away with, where's the thesis, right? This almost hunt for the argument and the thesis sometimes actually leads us into a blindness. And one of the kind of richnesses to actually allowing text to offer up their meaning making to us in a more explorative way, in a way that engages the connections and the meanings that they originally sought to make, is a useful intellectual exercise. So let me just try and see how I think this works in Manan's book and why I think these are really rich generative practices intellectually that we as scholars and students of history can engage in. So I'm going to actually go backwards through the book. The very first interesting kind of nested meaning making that is happening in Firishta's work that I think Manan does a beautiful job of picking up on is the idea of nested places. In other words, Hindustan is not simply a conceptual term that is giving meaning to a social community. Indeed, it is something very different. It is a place nested and connected with other places. We could call this a fuzzy geography, but in a way it is not a fuzzy geography because fuzziness does not have meaning making built into it. And yet in every way in which Firishta connects the different kinds of histories and communities of the place that he is talking about, whether it is in the Deccan, in this place called Hindustan, the various regions he enumerates, but also in the larger connected Indian Ocean, Central Asian, North African, and Middle Eastern worlds. Part of what Firishta is doing is actually making meaning and connecting those places, communities, and conceptual geographies together. So I just want to read a very, very short extract to kind of give you a taste of this. And this is on page 117. And Manan writes, quote, "Beyond mere description of place names, these texts domesticated subcontinental territory within a Muslim ecosystem. They also reformulated histories of encounters as histories of belonging. The temples and the circuits of pilgrimages associated with them constituted a form of territoriality. The political contestations between various polities were carefully placed within a borderland space, bracketed, peopled, and well understood. Hindustan was not res nullis, a place simply of warfare and in need of conquering. It was instead a place of political and social interdependence and growth of city-states across the peninsula." So we get the sense of this kind of entangled, contested, mutually generative placemaking that is a key part of the way in which these soldier scribes think about the pass of space. The next theme that I picked up on was also kind of a very beneficial one, particularly for our discipline, which is the idea of nested temporalities. In other words, I would hope our discipline has moved beyond this idea that there can only be a kind of flattened historiographical movement of time in the analysis that we do. Firishta, and indeed Manan, in reading Firishta, helps us to understand how the experience of time is indeed a very subjective one. But subjective not in the way that it is, quote, a bias or a delusion, or perhaps even from the Sufiya Bhakti perspective, an illusory experience of a particular kind of movement of time, but in a very rich way. When human beings experience time, they do it with the full understanding of the presence that they experience have been engendered by a shared past. And when they project a future, even if it is in the case of fantasist projections or their hopes, what they are doing is also making meaning of time. So that subjectivity then itself becomes a place where scholars can actively and fruitfully engage with ideas of temporality. More important in going and trying to understand Firishta's understanding of why the Mahabharata became a key text for him, what Manan demonstrates is the way in which contested but also engaged and mutually generative notions of temporality, space, and historical ordering did not need to be antagonistic. One very interesting movement that often happens in these texts written by soldier scribes is the way in which they can give mutually non-meaning making ideas of temporality side by side. And a very common way of ending is, and only God knows, which in a way is a refusal to bring a personal, even a culturally informed human subjectivity or judgment on the way in which temporalities are experienced by other words. In other words, by handing it over to a divine actor and leaving humans their own subjective truths as important ones to consider and not judge. An interesting move is being made there. In some ways, I think the question of nested temporalities is perhaps one of the most interesting methodological tools that Manan recovers from Firishta's history, and is one that he hands to us that is particularly important for historians, not just of South Asia, but of our mutually experienced global past, because each culture, each time, and even particular individuals order the experience of time very differently. And to take that subjective experience seriously without judgment is something historians have often failed to do. But one in which we actually do need to engage it if we ever going to understand the ways in which the past has been experienced and ordered within those subjective experiences. And then finally, I would go to my own favorite, which is the nested narratives. In other words, history does not have to be an orderly narrative account told from one subject person with the omniscient historian kind of creating a ruthlessly enforced order. A very common experience of reading these texts, of course, is the lovely phrase, "Me go yand," they say. And you know what's coming, right? There's going to be another tall story, another perhaps encounter with the ajaib, these kinds of departures and segues into other types of narrative traditions. A very common part of colonial translations is to ruthlessly edit them, throw shade on them, refuse to engage with them. Yet Firishta does this, and a lot of these soldier scribes do that in their histories. Why? Well, partly because in the rich polyvocality of the past that they now bring to the reader's attention, they're also saying something unique about the way in which people find meaning. And it's a kind of mani ofrini they're bringing, not simply from the Persianate context that they themselves were a part of, but it also becomes a rich engagement with the ways in which narratives of past, narratives of place, narratives of belonging, and even narratives of alienation from those spaces can be worked into the particular context that they are ordering into their histories. These three ideas, nested places, nested temporalities, nested narratives, I think are really rich tools to bring to the post-colonial experience of ordering histories. If we cease to reorder narratives of the past and the subjective experience of that past as ruthlessly into academic histories, I think we have a lot of hope. Manan is right to end his book on a note of caution. He tells us not to romanticize those very histories he has spent much of the book excavating. And I would like to end there also, because I think in letting us roam a little bit freer in trying to make meaning out of the text that we are encountering, it is also possible to then ask ourselves, are there other ways of framing these places, these temporalities, these narratives that perhaps the Persianate cannot fully encompass in the time period that Manan is looking at? And if that is the case, these tools still have a lot of possibilities, right? These are the very tools by which we can bring narratives that do not become available to us through one set of textual records. I found it very telling that when Manan talks about the places of Hindustan, for example, he goes to the inscriptional record, which is always a reminder to us of the ways in which the materiality of the past can be recovered, not just from the text of the manuscripts themselves, but from the material cultures that these people left behind. So there are spaces that work as kind of black areas in the Persianate that are still places that can be recovered with the tools Manan has brought to us. Just to give you a few examples, this wonderful region called Gondwana that is nestled in the northeastern of the Deccan, which continued through the Mughal period to be ruled by Gond, that is tribal rulers, and in fact managed to hang on to a lot of its ways of ordering and thinking space, while still having a very rich set of relationships with the Mughal polity as well as the Dakhni Sultanates to their south. Similarly, we can think about pastoral nomadic groups, everything from the well-ordered history of the Afghans of Hindustan, but also Gujars, Bhils, and other pastoral nomadic groups that have a history, but one that is not fully captured by the narratives of soldier scribes, which, although they traverse these spaces, often become ones of states and towns. And then finally, of course, it's kind of glaring that in the Deccan, we have very little encounters with the Telugu sweeping warriors that are sweeping and have their own migrations in the south that bring forth the Nayaka kingdoms that will actually outlast Mughal polities for a very long time. So in all kinds of ways, I think the tools are very valuable, because even if those Persianate narratives do not fully capture all the rich texture of the voices and experiences in the spaces that we are discussing today, the tools themselves offer possibilities for a much richer, a much more diverse post-colonial history of South Asia. And I thank Manan for the experience of letting me think about this for a little while. Congratulations.
Thank you very much, Professor Dhavan, for your very insightful comments. I would like to turn now to Professor Ramachandran, and our target is about 10 minutes, but I will, as I've been doing, sort of appear in person as we get, to the end of your time, and then you know that it's time to kind of wrap up. But
I am on it. I have planned 10 minutes, so I will not be longer. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this conversation today. When I was invited to respond to Manan's book a little while ago, my first thought was delight at the intellectual energy that I remembered from our first encounter when he presented an early version of some of these ideas that would become the Loss of Hindustan. My second thought was, I'm not a South Asian historian. I'm not even a historian. What do I possibly have to say that's intellectually rigorous and thoughtful about this mammoth project? But having read it with growing excitement and furious interest over the break, I can see why I'm here. This is a book that demands a wide-ranging, interdisciplinary, cross-lingual audience, and its impact is one that will be felt and should be felt across a vast swath of the humanities. Today, I will briefly discuss what its key contributions and stakes are for a student of comparative literature, of early modern cultural history, and specifically of what has come to be called the global Renaissance or global early modernity. As the student of the European Renaissance, I see the Loss of Hindustan as itself a deeply humanistic work, in that distinctly early modern sense of a commitment to thinking about historical difference, history writing, and the philosophical problems of temporality posed by the very task of writing a history of the deep past, one that feels cut off from the present, accessible only in fragments. And here I just want to sort of gesture to Purnima's really wonderful comments, especially about nested temporalities and what it means to simply make meaning of a past that's received in various material fragments that need to be arranged and thought of in simultaneous and not just linear ways. And here I should say, when I say Manan's project is humanistic, I mean it in a kind of a double sense. I think part of what this book does in a really important way is to recover and make explicit what I think we've already known, which is the terrible collusions of humanist thought, of European humanist thought with colonialism. And this has been made explicit in the Latin American context, and I'll talk more about that. But I think for Manan to sort of articulate for us the shape of what that humanist thought entailed and show us how that gets used and mobilized by British colonialism in India in particular is really crucial. And here I'll just outline very quickly that the broad shape of humanist history making in the 15th and 16th century in the recovery of the classical past, the classical European past, most importantly, the Roman Imperium, but also the ancient Greek past. And this imagination or positing of a lost golden age of antiquity that was then interrupted by the dark Middle Ages, only to be excavated and made new again by the Renaissance, literally to be born again, is precisely the structure that Manan identifies in the way in which colonial historiography adopts, suppresses, and erases pre-colonial history writing in the subcontinent. And so the mobilization of this kind of tripartite structure, which I will also say you can see having happened in the colonial historiography of broadly the Middle East as well, the positing of the Abbasid Golden Age, the decline, the return to modernity through colonialism. That arc, which we've seen imposed in various parts of the world, is one that Manan makes very explicit in the ways in which it is worked out in the South Asian context. So this sense of how humanists, the kind of highly valorized mode of humanist writing itself became the vehicle for colonial ideology in the making of subcontinental history is one that the Loss of Hindustan shows us in practice. At the same time, however, it's worth saying that Manan's book is also humanistic in the sense that it recognizes within that humanistic mode of history writing the charge of a kind of resistant or decolonial impulse. And by what I mean by this is, we will remember in the 15th century that the early Italian humanists were understood themselves to be somewhat under colonial pressure by the French and the Spanish. And so, of course, famously, the end of Machiavelli's Prince, the call for the emancipation of Italy, echoed in other texts by famous canonical figures like Petrarch and others, is also about how the history itself can offer us a way to think ourselves ideologically out of the colonial bind, right? And so this is the kind of charge already within the broad tradition of history writing that Manan notices, brings, and I think brings to bear in his own excavation of the work of Firishta and others in the pre-colonial subcontinent. So anchored on the Tarikh-i Firishta, the book looks forward to colonial historiography in which it would play a foundational role, and further forward to Enlightenment histories of philosophy from Voltaire to Schelling via Kant, Herder, and Hegel, in which it would be a crucial subterranean intertext. At the same time, it also looks backward to the intellectual traditions that led to the innovative reimagination of history in the Tarikh. For Firishta's own history was an exemplary early modern text, one that sought to reflect on and shape its own historicity. Anchored in its own classical pasts, it sought to mobilize and rethink the epistemologies that were already in flux in the early 17th century. If all Manan's book did was to narrate this astonishing archaeology of a key text in the making of colonial historiography that is still with us today, it would be an achievement. But what Manan offers is a double-barreled theoretical argument that goes much beyond intellectual historical excavation. He argues on the one hand that we need to fundamentally reimagine how we have conceptualized the pre-colonial history of the region we now call South Asia by questioning the very categories that are applied to frame its study. And on the other hand, he issues a call for a decolonial reinterpretation of the core texts of the philosophy of history, Kant and Hegel chief among them, who still ground thinking in a range of fields. Let me take these two briefly in turn. So, calling for a reimagination of how we conceptualize pre-colonial history or medieval and early modern history broadly, the sort of history that predates the rupture of colonialism, is a complicated question because as Purnima pointed out, the point here is not to vault over the fact of colonialism, but to think through colonialism and to recognize that the archive we have of the pre-colonial is mediated powerfully by the colonial, and there is simply no getting away from that. So in this regard, inspired among others by Trouillot's emphasis on the silences in history and the erasures of the archive, The Loss of Hindustan, I think, brings to South Asian history and historiography the probing questions about the colonial grip on the archive and control of a historical authority that has transformed the fields of indigenous history and the colonial history of the Americas in the last couple of decades. And I was intrigued to discover that, in fact, this book began in Mexico, thinking with these materials that have been, I think, at the heart of a sort of historical reorientation for writing the kind of early modern history of the Americas. By making this comparison, though, I'm thinking of my own interest in the framing of a global early modern history, which has had to grapple with the almost complete destruction of indigenous sources in different parts of the world, questions about what kinds of materials constitute historical evidence in the first place. Is the poem a history? Is an oral narrative a history? Is an amulet with fragments of text or symbols on it materials for a history? And also then a forced reliance on the mediation of colonial European compendia, collections, and archives, whose restructuring and reinscription of indigenous materials in new frames completely transforms how those materials can even be understood. And here I think the call to kind of think about what does it mean to be working in archives in France, in Britain, in Italy, and elsewhere, Germany, to kind of think about how we get to that pre-colonial past, also asks us to think about how our understanding of those objects are framed by the places in which we now find them. While this is a key question in some sectors of early modern studies, largely with regard to the histories of marginalized people, women, indigenous and enslaved peoples, it has not been applied in the same way to the subjects of polities and cultural formations that were not considered primitive or marginal because they were thought to be endowed with an ancient cultural past. And here I want to note that one of the real intellectual achievements, I think, of this book is to help us see how the colonial establishment of a Hindu history that was ancient, timeless, and suspended actually primitivizes in a powerful way the seeming supposedly complex Vedic culture and makes it equivalent to the indigenous primitive that is valorized and fetishized in a different sense by the same European historiography. So to understand those two in comparative context is to see how the creation of universal histories of philosophy were predicated on asserting the existence of a primitive that isn't really troubled until well into the post sort of Second World War period, right? And I think we're still grappling with what does it mean to think about the indigenous in the first place and what constitutes a notion of the primitive, both words that I think emerge interestingly in different aspects of Manan's project. So very quickly, moving to what does it mean to sort of take a decolonial reinterpretation of the cortex of the philosophy of history. And here I will say that the quest for writing universalizing accounts for history that was supposedly all-encompassing and inclusive, by figures like Hegel and Kant and others, was also obscured over and again, that these very figures relied on the kind of insidious thrust of colonial historiography that trafficked in these erasures and silences to make possible a vision of a kind of universal macro history, right? And I think this problem is with us again right now in a really crucial sense. The turn towards world history, global history is an iteration of this 18th century Enlightenment moment of writing universal histories of philosophy. And I think Manan's book offers us a kind of morality tale for our own desire to both write more inclusive histories, but at the same time to warn us against what kinds of erasures certain forms of universalist inclusion bring about, right? And so I think that one of the crucial questions I have, and I would love to hear Manan talk about more today, is precisely how do we think about this juxtaposition of a desire for writing the universal and thinking about these sort of broad questions of inclusion, of comparison, of transnational traffic, of entangled histories, while also holding close to the fact that the macro tends to make blurry what is micro, right? And like how exactly do we hold both these things? And I think this takes us back to the question of temporality and possible simultaneity. I will conclude by sort of with two quick notes. One is, as a student of comparative literature, this book issues what is in some ways a profoundly simple and profoundly important call, which is read your sources in the original languages and do not rely on translations that may have their own problems. And we tell our students all the time, you must learn many languages. And if you're going to work on a period, do not just rely on translations in one language, because really that's not okay. This becomes especially critical in the writing of pre-colonial history in geographies that have been marked by the displacements of the colonial archive. So as a literary scholar, I take this book as an exemplary instance of why we need to read and learn more languages, even as the pressures to not do so in our training become ever greater. So I'll stop there. And Manan, thank you. This has been such a productive and exciting book for me to think with. I will be teaching with it for many years to come, and I hope this is the beginning of many conversations.
Thank you very much. I would like to remind people that if you're not one of our panelists, please turn off your video. It really kind of disrupts our ability to see who's here and who's not on the panel if your video is on. So thank you. Our next speaker is Dr. Desai.
Thank you, and thank you very much for actually including me. And I should say that, Kathy, as you were introducing me, I realized that none of those things really matter in terms of why I'm here. And so first, I should say that you might almost feel like I'm an interloper if you only heard all the things that I've done in my life. But it actually has to do with, and I have to thank Manan for this, is to bringing me back to my first love. So that has to do with coming to this book, not so much as a president or a chair of global thought. It's all of that, but it is actually where I began my journey. And that was to be a 17th century art historian and to really focus on the Rajput kingdoms in the 17th century and looking at the Mughal-Rajput interaction, which has been one of my preoccupations for a very long time. The second reason why I have to thank Manan for this is that it does bring back the kind of questions that I'm interested in, which is something that Aisha just talked about as well. And that is, how do you actually look at a macro picture without losing the micro? And what is that relationship in terms of whether it's a simultaneity and temporality, but the specificity that actually also brings up the broader questions? And the fact of the matter is that Manan has done something incredibly important and exciting, and that is to have a razor-sharp focus on the specificity of the book, Firishta's book, Tarikh-i Hindustan, and be able to zoom out and to look at that in a methodological way. What does it really mean for us? And therefore, what are the lessons that it can give us looking at in a broader perspective? So for me, that was really what was so exciting about reading the book, thinking about this, and thinking also with our students at the Committee on Global Thought, where they brought lots of comparative perspective and questions that came up. So what I have to say is as much to bring me back to my first love and to think about the work that I'm doing now, which is to try to come up with this notion of comparative, connective, and Fisher-oriented notions of local and the global, in which Manan has been very, very helpful as we go forward. So let me start with the first perspective. And I should say the last perspective I want to bring is why I was interested in this book, is where the subcontinent is, where India is today, and why history matters, and what kind of history matters, and where we go back to actually find the details, to remind people of the world that it could be, not the world as it is. especially in the subcontinent today, in India today. So the first part is to really look at the book from my perspective as a 17th century art historian and what it brought up for me as I was reading the book. So the first thing that I very much was aware of is by choosing Firishta, based in the Deccan, how much in the world of the 17th century art history, we have sometimes thought of these regions as periphery, not at the center. And yet these peripheral regions actually give us some information and ways of thinking about that world that otherwise is not available to us. So I started with that very same period, and my own dissertation was on Rasika Priya by Keshav Das, who was actually a poet in Orcha and went to the Mughal court. And the first known manuscript of the Rasika Priya is in the provincial Mughal style, probably done by somebody in Agra, where Keshav Das was completely surrounded by all kinds of intellectuals at the court, initially at the Akbar court and then at the court of Jahangir. And it made me realize that, my goodness, have I looked at Keshav Das manuscripts other than even Rasika Priya, a great Braj poet? What is he saying about the place that he's in? How do we think about this? And at the same time, we used to think that all of these things were possible because of Akbar. It was an exception. It was unusual that people came from all different parts of the subcontinent, the world, and it was very cosmopolitan. It was multi-religious, it was multicultural. And then to read Firishta, where he is actually talking about the idea of Hindustan in the same kind of language, if you will, and to recognize that this was the norm, not unusual, not just something that we credit Akbar with, but that it was actually part and parcel of the fabric of the society. So for me, the pieces that really stood out were the correspondences between the Raja of Kashmir and going out to talking to other people, the conversations that happened in Gujarat and what that was like, where there was an awareness of people, different creed, different real languages, different cultures coming together, how much that was a norm, not an exception. And yet how we have forgotten that idea of the norm, and even the very idea of Hindustan, embodying these kinds of multiplicity, polarity, and diversity of thought, diversity of languages, diversity of cultures coming in some way, not necessarily together, but at least side by side and sometimes coming together. But side by side is as important as coming together. And that idea turning on its head, coming from the Deccan, not from the Mughal court, and yet using even all the other facilities and resources that were there. So as Purnima said, to use Mahabharata as a document of history is as important as languages, history, poetry that come from other places. So then it brought up the question for me also of what are the other kind of material tools, the work that I was completely drawn to and involved with for a long time. And it reminded me that things that you learn from objects, paintings, things you learned from archives in Rajasthan, which actually most of my art historical colleagues had never really done before too much. And I realized that just by going through those court archives, obviously the tradition of writing about the moment and history within the Sanskritic or Braj tradition is quite different from the Persian tradition. And oftentimes we talk about that as a Islamic versus non-Islamic. And it's useful to think, and that's something that I really learned also, Manan, from you, is to really be careful how we describe it, that there are cultural practices, there are linguistic practices, and not to put the kind of overlay of the religious nomenclature that people often would use. So, for example, to go to the Bikaner archives and to learn that lots of non-illustrated manuscripts, especially of Rasika Priya or other love poems and Nayak Nayika traditions, often were commissioned by women. Often were commissioned by women to give as dowry gifts, to go someplace, and yet nobody had actually thought about as to who is commissioning these things. And we had always privileged the male rulers, who were the court rulers, as the patrons of all things. And these are the kind of little things that come up and say, what does it really mean when we say this is the patronage or this is not? Whose voices are excluded, and how do we recover them? And that's where I think that, as Purnima was saying, the tools available to us not only matter, but how we read them. And what do we read and what we don't read? How do we interpret them? So from the painting side, I actually have been very interested, for example, in the connection between Bikaner and the Deccan. And most of the painting archives that we have are actually Bikaner rulers in the Deccan at the time of Aurangzeb's conquest or going incursions into the Deccan, painted by artists who had come from the courts, both of the Deccan and the Mughal court, into Bikaner, creating documents that actually are of that moment. And yet, oftentimes we always think that it's all mediated through somebody else. So these interconnections give us some sense of how the idea of the subcontinent, the idea of these regional, actually we're going back and forth all the time. And yet that's not something we focus on very much. So when I was reading the idea of Hindustan, idea of India and the loss of Hindustan, the thing that really, why it appealed to me is by doing things by places, place-making, people-making, and then the interactivity that comes up through that. I think that then it's worthwhile to recognize that because of the Persianate tradition and the Arabic tradition of writing history is of a very different nature than the Sanskritic or the Braj tradition, that we need to think about how do we recover that information. What are they saying about this moment is the kind of work we need to do within that period, which some people have done in the Sanskritic tradition, but not enough in this period of kind of 15th through 17th century that needs to come from the other angles as well. And if the tools are different, so be it. The tools will be probably in inscription, tools will be in land grants, the tools will be in paintings, in objects. But we almost now need to come to that awareness of this multiplicity, awareness of the linguistic, cultural multiplicity that Khusru talks about so well in the 18th century, right? And I want to kind of read, Manan, that first particular poem that you use in the book that I think is really worth thinking about, that idea of understanding the primacy of certain language, but also the awareness of the presence of all others. So this is, in fact, how Khusru talks about it, as quoted by Manan in the book. Sindhi and Lahori, Kashmir and Kubur, Dur Samandari, Tilangi and Gujari, Mabari and Guri, Bengali and Avdi are spoken in Delhi. And in frontiers around, these are all languages of Hind from times ancient. For all commoners alike, they're useful. Yet, one other language is crucial to know for all Brahmins. since old ages. It is called Sanskrit. Though the common folks are not attuned to its rules, the Brahmin knows, but all Brahmins do not understand the depth of this speech. It is like Arabic in its complexity, its grammar, vocabulary, appreciation, and poetics. It's that awareness of, yes, there are certain languages that may be central, but how they're practiced and awareness of it all is something that we need to continue to remind ourselves, whereas what has happened, I find, in a lot of the scholarship on India is either there's a primacy of Sanskrit or the primacy of Persian or Arabic, but the regional manifestations don't come back into that conversation. And that's why I think when Purnima was talking about Gond and how they manage that relationship, we need to bring those back in. And yet, when we think about the studies of the subcontinent, regional languages don't always come in as much as they should be, I believe, in understanding of where we are. And let me just say that I think the thing that I really, really appreciated, Manan, about the book on the other side is history making and its relevance to the present. And how do we make sense of it and at the same time project it out? Because the historians have such an important role, especially in recovering ways of thinking about this region called Hindustan or the subcontinent, and how we actually reclaim the idea that has been part and parcel of Firishta going back to the early 17th century, and not romanticize it, recognize the limitation, but at the same time, at least inject it back in, that this is also the reality that people experienced all around us. And that way, your commitment to looking at the methodology and your commitment to exploring and excavating what comes from Firishta and bringing it together is so, so very powerful. And so I feel like it opens up whole other ways of looking at those voices that actually need to be brought back in terms of the non-Persianate traditions into looking at this very period too.
Thank you very much, Vishakha. So I see you've all come back alive. So we'll turn now to basically an actual panel discussion amongst you. Maybe begin with Manan's reactions or any thoughts you have, and then just feel free to talk amongst yourselves.
Thank you very much. I am so, I guess, humbled by the richness of everyone's comments and how you've seen some of the efforts that I have tried to do in the book and said it more eloquently than I could, and also how politely you have skipped over the faults that may be in the book. So I appreciate that. I want to actually pick up the thread that's in all three of the comments, because I think it's kind of critical both as a methodology question, but also as Vishakha was saying, the burden of history writing we face now, which is this relationship between the particular and the grander, or the local and the world, the Gond and the empire, and how as historians we are focused to specialize in order to tell the smaller story or to kind of bring it to attention, while some of us are also contesting with narratives that are universalizing or grander or harmonizing difference in a different way. And I think one of the difficulties that I've faced myself as a historian who works on my first book, my first effort was really in the 11th through 13th century, is that our access to the particularity or to the micro is non-existent to be, as a documentary traces, is maybe non-existent or maybe very, very limited. And so we are at the mercy of the grand narrative, right? So why should we care about an account of the Indian Ocean sailor from the 9th or 10th century we have to kind of make sense of it within something called the Indian Ocean world and larger kind of narratives about what traffic or movement looks like. And so what happens is that with these small, tiny bits of meaning making have to contend with the kind of over-determined over-determination that those narratives impose upon us. For the period that I was looking at, the 17th century mainly, I think one of the things that I was struggling theoretically to contend with was that the Mughal polity and its eventual demise becomes the big story. So you may have to see the Mughals in relationship to the Safavids or the Ottomans or the Milans. But the story that I wanted to tell was about Hindustan. I wanted to tell it from the perspective of the Deccan, precisely because it allowed me to find a middle ground between the very grand story that's legible to everyone because of historiography, but also because of actual cultural footprint, but also the very particular that Firishta, in my places chapter, it was actually really difficult. Firishta is in many ways a cultural, what we now would call a cultural historian, right? So he's very interested in the whys of why some community does something. But the experience of reading Firishta is overwhelming because you're just like ingesting all of this information. You're like, oh my God, when does it stop? Like, when is he going to kind of, not give me 5 different ways of cooking onions and just tell me, this is the right Desi way of cooking onions. We all know it, right? So I think that methodologically puts a lot of pressure on us as historians to navigate. And I think one of the things that I found useful, pardon the background noise. One of the was actually to again rely on some of the as Aisha pointed out, some of the innovations that have come out of Caribbean studies, have come out in Latin American studies, and especially in queer and feminist thought and Black feminist thought, that has foregrounded the relationship between the fragment and the meta narrative, and what allows you to kind of contend with the silencing and the silences as agentive processes in the making. And to me, I think the idea that we can contend with the idea of scale, as Purnima put it so beautifully, as nested scales, was really kind of attractive idea. Like I was really taken by the idea that I can actually have multiple scales and multiple temporalities and not be forced to answer just to the grand narrative, whether it's the colonial grand narrative or nationalist grand narrative or historiographic, or to contend to make a micro study about a particular region, particular people. And it was a lot easier in a way for my first book because I relied on this methodology of walking, or the hermeneutic of walking, because it allowed me to be scaled in my reading of Uch and the text, that Chashnama that I worked on. But I'm a Pakistani citizen, and my capacity to walk in the Deccan or in Delhi or where the Gonds walked is prohibited, not because of my own kind of my body, but by my passport. And so how do we then, as post-colonized historians, think about the nationalist boundaries? I mean, I've always have had to apply for the ridiculous UK visa and the Schengen visa to even enter the archives in Berlin or London or Paris. And I've always felt humiliated by that exercise. I've always felt that my colleagues who hold American passports or EU passports could get on a plane and go to the archive, and I couldn't. And what that does to kind of the capacity to imagine a frictionless access to the early modern or the medieval part was something that I felt untheorized or even acknowledged in the work that we do. And so part of it was to kind of in order to kind of build out these nested categories, I wanted to also put the friction between them to be much more clear in the soldier scribes and the Hindustani historians. And finally, I just want to say something that I'm really thankful for Vishakha's point about, these when we think of the local, in many ways, we are consumed by the particularity of it, right? So the language, the vista, the question that the archive allows us to ask. And I felt in the writing of this book that one of the other ways that I was forced out of the local over and over again was by contemplating the ethics of what Firishta was engaged in, what these historians who were writing in the 1920s and 30s were engaged in, and then by extension, the ethics of what I may or may not contribute to this question. So I think that was another ways in which the kind of nestedness unhinged me from my biases, my weaknesses, and my situatedness in order to kind of contemplate these broader questions about the philosophy of history and decolonizing the way we kind of think of these things. So I'm so very grateful to your comments. They're just so amazingly insightful, even to me, because one of the superpowers I have is that I forget everything I type immediately after I type it. And it's really a good thing that I find helps me sleep easily. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
I just wanted to kind of say that it seemed to me that the truth is that you're constantly aware of the multifocal points of view, so that you're always going in and out. And so that you almost don't have to worry about being too local, hyper local, not asking the broader questions. And to me, it's remarkable that you're just doing it all the time. And that's how you organize the book. And that's why it's so, I think Purnima was right, that it's as much about what you're saying as how you actually went about doing it. And the methodology is as important and organizing as is what you're saying.
Yeah, it's a real model for those of us in several disciplines to draw on.
Can I ask the question actually, or are we moving on to audience questions?
Well, so I think we'll sort of maybe just a little your immediate thoughts, and then we'll move into audience pretty quickly. So yeah, go ahead.
Just a quick, sort of having listened to the comments, but also your response, Manan, I just wonder if you might want to take the opportunity to comment on periodization, because I think what's extraordinary about this book is in some ways it's a challenge to the way not just historians, but historians of all stripes, right? I mean, literary historians, cultural historians think about the notion of period, right? And I think that you slide between using terms like pre-colonial, colonial, using terms like medieval, classical, and then sometimes medieval, early modern. And of course, each of these carry different kinds of historiographic freight, and I think gesture us towards the possible histories we might write or should be writing, and I think have a different freight in thinking anti-colonially or decolonially. And so I just wonder if you might comment on that.
Thank you, Aisha. I mean, I think, as you very nicely put, and in how you were kind of drawing our attention to the invention of the ancient in the 16th century, in the 15th century, and the role it plays in kind of this renaissance of humanistic writing. I think the periodization debate for the subcontinent, the historiography of the subcontinent, becomes almost cast in stone at the beginning of the 19th century, when this idea of ancient and golden and dark and medieval and liberal and modern is said. And so it's very difficult for the historians of the subcontinent to really kind of shift that dichotomy, even though almost every single generation of historians tries very valiantly to do it, including Muhammad Habib in the 1920s. But we can think, to the kind of critical work done by people like Sanjay Subramaniam, and Narayana Rao more recently, and David Shulman, in kind of trying to subvert some of these categories through rethinking, as John F. Richards, another eminent historian, Mughal historian, tried to invigorate early modern for the subcontinent and received a pushback. I think I don't actually feel that I have any great resolution on this question. It becomes a question of training and a question of what and how we want to think about the periods. I think what perhaps what Purnima was astutely pointing out with her comment again on the nested temporalities, and people like Shahzad Bashir and others have kind of done more recently, was to kind of re-enliven concepts of time that that are not apparent through the paradigms that we are currently having in our disciplinary kind of conversation. And re-enlivening these various concepts of temporalities may not do away with periodization, because it's also contingent upon our literal jobs that we have and the conferences we hold and journal titles. But it does force us to think more broadly about the type of narrative that is allowed in. Once, I mean, as you at the end of your comments were also saying, the question of the poetics, or the question of pottery to poetry to pottery being kind of voices that can we think about. But I think having those fluid temporalities as a disciplinary practice, if not certainly maybe too big a task to have them as disciplinary norm, but at least as practice of history writing, does open up spaces. I guess my take for this particular book was to show how if I can be so crude, the sausage was made. and just by saying, like, if I can do this, maybe the next step will become more imminent, that how do we kind of then get out of it. So I think in the chapter on archive, I tried to just say, like, how are the little bits of the golden age era constructed, and by making it aware that this is a constructivist past, perhaps the temporalities that are missing from the colonial episteme, and then may continue to miss from even our own work, that starkness, I think, comes to relief. And I feel that may be a way forward for us to kind of think about some of these categories. I hope that answers some of your thoughts. Thank you.
Did anybody else want to say anything before we open it up? Okay, so I would like to open it up for audience questions. I think the best way to do it is to raise your hand, and then you can ask
virtual hand, or
raise your virtual hand. There's a place under, thank you, under reactions, under the tab reactions, that says raise hand. And if you do that, I think it moves your window up and we see it, or I see it on the side chat. And then you can turn on your video and mic to speak orally. If you'd prefer to type it in the chat on the side, that's okay too. And now we have the technical aspect of whether I see any hands, which I don't yet. And if I'm missing it somehow, then just turn off your video and audio so that we can see and hear you and just ask. Let's see. Am I doing something wrong that I'm not seeing them? Well, while we're waiting on the technicalities of that, I'll please feel free to engage in the conversation amongst yourselves. Gayatri Spivak has a question.
Yes, and I'm really, I don't want to move with the silence, so I thought I would ask the question. It's a little remote as a question, so please forgive me, but then, there was nobody asking. First of all, Manan, fantastic book, which I have not read yet. I've ordered, but I haven't read yet. I certainly will, especially around Gondwana. It's very important for me, my work on Mahasweta. But I will also say that I have, however, elaborately discussed the fact that I'm only an Indian citizen. So I share with you this particular thing, I don't feel feel humiliated. I think of it as my field work. When I listen to others talking about the relationship between diaspora and located places, etc. But what I was thinking about when I looked at the title of your book was, of course, The Invention of Africa, Valentin Mudimbe's book, which really, and so you go to the Caribbean, you go to various other places, but I would very much like to see you expand yourself to the impossibility of taking the invention of Africa as a model. For me, that has all, I'm not an Africanist, but I've really undone my specialty in trying to see Africa not just as a scandal. You know what I mean? Because the idea, your wonderful word, loss, the loss of Hindustan. See, the loss of Africa is that would really give one, given the wealth of languages and the unsystematized languages, it is really something that doesn't allow us to make this kind of movement that is so fantastic in your work. And I just wanted to also say that in terms of speaking from an Islamic majority area that it was, I mean, I'm now working on the Ramsay MacDonald's communal award and so on and so forth, looking at the fact that Bengali Islam has been so, Khosrow mentions Bengal, which is fantastic. Ayesha Jalal mentions Bengal. Asya Jabar mentions Bengal. These are very important things. So the Bengali Islam is now being mobilized to stop the imagining of the Rohingyas, who also in my neck of the woods actually should be epistemically rearranged this way. So I'm putting in a word for that. And finally, since I haven't read the book, I don't know if you talk about it. I was just asked by the polymath folks in Britain to imagine the books that I would take with me on a desert island. And I said I would take a Chagtai English textbook, because grammar, because a good one has just been written, because I want to read the original fragments of the Babarnama, because I'm quite sure you're talking about Babar in your book. But in my case, I have romanticized him because when I look at the way, forget everything else, the word exists in Bengali, right? When I first cut my hair, shoulder length, I was told by everyone in Calcutta that I had cut my hair in a Babri cut. It's still called Babri. You know, people don't even know that that's referring to Babar. But anyway, when I first looked, you see, I hadn't seen the Taj Mahal, so I went in 2012. And in 2012, I went to those gardens. And when one looks, I mean, even with all of the changes at Babar's first garden and looks at the original fragments in English, one realizes, I think it's been ruined by all of the big Babarnamas. One looks at the fact that this young man, who's unbelievable, was actually trying to understand the land as subject. What does it need, the gardener? And I really saw, and that's why I'm taking that book. And I want very much for you to tell me if this romanticization is also okay. Sometimes you need, given from where you come, you know, I'm only an Indian citizen born a Brahmin. So I think I need to romanticize a little. And I'll end with just a remark about Eric Williams, whose book you undoubtedly have read, Capitalism and Slavery. And right at the end, and since I just read it yesterday, I can tell you page 179, he says that one of the problems today and from the 19th century in emphasizing the humanitarian in the movement against the slave trade has been to sentimentalize, put sentimentalization over scholarship. And I think since the African cases are so strong in my mind, I think that your notion of not romanticizing can be connected to that today because of the need for all of us to think of the heritage of slavery within history as such. So this has been disorganized. I wasn't going to ask the first question, but since there was a silence, I thought I would just start it off. Okay. You can ignore this and go on.
No, thank you so much, Gayatri. It's obviously you were there at the my last books.
If I could just interrupt one more thing, is Foucault and Najibullah. You know, I wrote a piece called Foucault and Najibullah, which is written by a person who knows nothing. But I feel that as a subcontinental intellectual, given the majoritarian stuff, both in Europe and in India, it is our obligation to forget the fact that we know nothing, move forward. And so anyone who can read Bengali, read the conversation between Sugato and myself in Anandabajar Patrika on so-called Republic Day against what's happening in India today. Carry on.
Right, thank you. You know, I think Professor Mudimbe's Invention of Africa, Ali Mazruri's work, Mahmoud Mamdani, there's so many important ideas of thinking through Africa and with Africa, African history and European encounter with Africa that are certainly part of my intellectual framework. And also, I think just to highlight the point that you began with, which is you foreground your Indianness. I will maybe modify that by saying your example remains unique in doing so. I think you are obviously a teacher for all of us on so many occasions and all, but that in particular, where I felt that the scholar's relationship with the archive and the scholar's relationship with the structures of national hierarchical as a Muslim after 9/11, one of the things that I felt was extremely uncomfortable in terms of conversations was to actually foreground my nationalism and my access to everything from fellowships to visas. So I thank you for that. But I think one of the things that becomes important is to understand exactly as you were saying with the Rohingya example, is that nationalisms, while are confronted by this creation of the other, in Pakistan's case with Balochistan and with Ahmadis and with Shias in India, we are seeing this idea of Rohingya, Muslim, Bangladeshi being targeted not just in the Northeast, but also in Delhi. I think one of the things that the book tries to do is to demonstrate how the making of these meta-narrative, these majoritarian narratives, were involved by the history writing process again. And I think that bit obviously is maybe not too profound a point, but that's something that I felt to be an ethical obligation. And last thing I'll say in terms of your desire for Chagatai, I think Wheeler Thaxton has a Chagatai Persian English 3-volume. His dissertation was on Baburnama. So I think, or maybe his first book, I forget now. But he has 3 volumes. So if it would be heavy to carry to the island, but maybe in a Kindle version we can take it.
Yes, the Kindle version. And see, I don't like the idea of too much scholarship before I read it. I'm a literary person. So you see, that's why I talked about encountering the garden, to know what the land wants, the land as subject rather than object of knowledge. It's fantastic. Anyway, I won't go on. Now there are other people asking questions, I'm sure.
Actually, given that people are being a little slow to raise their hands, I will ask a question and then I'll turn to the next questioner. This is a comment. I think it was Aisha that made it about the issue of the problems of translation and the issue of student training, that students need to know all these languages in order to do these, to really understand these texts. But it also raises the question of the very structure of scholarship and how it shapes the way we produce these narratives. That one could imagine a different kind of production where people with different specializations, different language specializations, for example, come together to interpret an array of texts that are relevant in a particular, for a particular study. And I'm just wondering if this kind of thinking about the structure of our scholarship itself and how it shapes the text is something that any of you have thought about, or whether there might be alternatives.
Yeah, I mean, I think like collaborative, comparative work. I mean, some of the projects that you mentioned, Kathy, in the beginning, that I'm engaged in on decolonization and on the are particularly built around exactly, you know, scholars working together. I mean, in an ideal world, you know, working with Purnima and working with Aisha would be precisely the type of work that I could do and I should be doing. And I think there is a question of kind of the type of production we need to do in order to remain gainfully employed and what gets counted. But I think that's definitely the model. Pamela?
Thanks. Now we have Pamela Smith.
Hi, thank you. Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me. Thank you so much to all of you. This has been just inspiring. I'm a historian of early modern Europe, and as Manan talked about recipes for onions, I think about the way that I've been engaged for, you know, the last several years in trying to figure out how to integrate you know, these particular unforthcoming recipe texts into the history of science. And, you know, there's very little that is more colonial than the history of science as it has been written. I mean, science as modernity is an incredibly powerful narrative that has, you know, marginalized and suppressed all kinds of actors. So, you know, I just want to think about, because it's such a, you know, constant question for myself and my students, you know, how we can both integrate these fragmentary and, you know, very unforthcoming texts into a larger macro narrative if we need to. And I'm not sure that we need to, but, you know, the present really calls out for new macro narratives. And I guess the way that I've tried to do it is to think very over long geographic and long temporal spans, so that to take the materials and the recipes, little fragments of text, and follow them through the itineraries and the places in which they change meaning. I mean, to see how they have actually made meaning in new ways and new places. And so, you know, this allows, I think, can allow a kind of connected narrative of discrete different places and allow you to excavate within each of those places, you know, the ways in which meaning was made about all kinds of things, you know, not just material culture, but the kind of, you know, culture that is produced through material culture, that, you know, through the training, the ways in which materials and recipes train people in skills and form communities and so on and so forth. So I just, you know, I'm so full of admiration for your book, which I haven't read, but which I am going to buy today, and for also just the comments on it. And I want you to just reflect, if you would, about, you know, itineraries. And I know you use the methodology of walking, which actually is quite inspiring, and how, you know, itineraries can form new narratives and new periodization. You know, it really throws periodization out the window. It allows us to like stop at different nodes along the way and see how those are periods, you know, in themselves.
Thank you, Pamela. I mean, just for all the people who are in the audience today, just to point out that Professor Smith's Making and Knowing project is really a model for all of us in terms of her intervention in the history of science and kind of thinking through material culture and through the making project, building new paradigms of how to do not just early modern history, but just history period. So I'm really thankful for your question, Pamela. I think Firishta, it should be a major part of history of science because he was among his many roles, he was also a field physician. So he has an entire book on how to fix bones, how to reattach a severed neck while the person is still alive. Very great anecdote. I failed as a scholar in not including it in my book. I just couldn't find a place for it. and all kinds of recipes of unguents and stuff that he kind of creates. And so I think, in a sense, it becomes an idea where, and if I can use it in a dialogue with my own book. So what happens that in the discovery of Firishta and his rendition into Europe, the actual kind of Hindustan of Firishta is discarded, and Firishta becomes a metonym for all other kinds of information that Europe, specifically the British, are kind of use him as a carrier text. And I think one of the things that as you're pointing out, that material culture links itineraries of movements of individual products or recipes, or even objects, allows us to do is to kind of invert the carrier text kind of structure. And so I think what happens is, it's two things. I think one of the things I teach whenever I teach Darwin, which is once a year, is to actually teach the Beagle Diaries other people are on the Beagle, and the other objects they're carrying alongside Darwin, and showing that early 19th century world, and also to kind of reinforce this idea that colonial, the capacity of the colonial states to move and to push and to pull, not just peoples and objects, but knowledges. And how do we kind of find spaces in that work? So I think I totally agree with you that one of the ways in which we can rethink periodization is to think it through a process, really, right? Like it would become like, how do you make a curry in 5 different places becomes a process question, and not a period question. So I think that's a wonderful comment. Thank you.
That's a good way to put it. Thank you so much, Manan.
Thank you.
If I may quickly jump in to respond to that. Thank you, Professor Smith. That's a wonderful question. And, Manan's book actually made me think about this a different way. A lot of these histories do go through a process of cataloging the arts, what they call the fan, or the Honormand, the gifted people in each place. And this is usually where the non-elite get noticed, right? The master craftsmen, the tile makers, the weavers. In some way, this is an elite acknowledgement of the productivity of labor and what is holding up those societies. But I think this is where a counter methodology using those ideas of, what meaning is being created by that is important, because if you flip that list, what you are getting basically is a material archive we have barely begun to scratch, right? And the processes and the entanglements that connect them. One of the games I play with my students when I teach South Asia is to remind them we're looking at a society where 1/3 of the people are still pastoral nomadic. Most people will not make it past their 45th birthday. 2/3 of the population is likely under the age of 20. And yet the narratives and the sources we are going to be reading are largely by older or middle-aged men in ways that don't really reflect the societies that we are looking at. And where South Asia is experiencing a kind of wave of engagement with what we can call the dawning of early capitalism, just like Indian textiles and manufactured goods are bringing a whole bunch of people into an upward social mobility and freeing them from a casteist society and allowing them to experience a new kind of self-fashioning. Those same textiles, those same shiploads of rice and Indian goods are being exchanged through commercial networks and feeding into a history of Atlantic slavery. So in other words, part of what happens here is the processes that link them together are having entirely different asymmetric effects all over. But part of the burden of looking at those lists and those surveys of labored goods that our histories are giving us is to then read back, hopefully with the material culture, the experiences of all the people and all these transformative effects, including actually engagements with the non-human world that these histories do not actually let us see textually, and yet they're gesturing to them. And I think it's those kinds of moments of silence that are particularly generative.
Yeah, that's another thing, is how we can, I'm sorry to break in, but I'm just so excited by what you said, the non-human world that they give access to. I mean, that's another part of this that, is so important, so central, that we don't have access to the environmental effects of all of those kinds of trade and crafts and everything else. So to actually be able to access that non-human world, I think is also, absolutely central.
I just want to jump into and say that in the wake of this conversation that hasn't been observed, which is, Manan, you also remind us that the Enlightenment, even in Europe, marks a real rupture between like what went before and what went after. So as a European early modernist, Firishta was incredibly legible to me because so many European texts of this period behave the same way, right? I mean, that there's a way in which that something happens with the Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment European historiography that also elides that kind of history writing in Europe. Right. So I think that part of what you're also making legible are these points of contact that exist pre-Enlightenment in this world that is linked in these asymmetrical ways that Purnima just described. And those lists are lists that anyone who works in the 16th or 17th century in other geographies also recognizes because it's a modality of engaging with the world, right? One that gets erased, suppressed, written out of what constitutes history after the Enlightenment. So I mean, there's that aspect of it as well.
But
Yeah,
I
that's
think
such
just
an
to,
important part. Yeah.
yeah,
Sorry.
I mean, I also think that, Manan, what you said before that really is striking vis-a-vis Firishta. And that is that, as you were saying, that so many people use the specificity of what he's saying, but not the conceptual framing. So what gets erased is the intentionality. And then it's used only for particular purposes. And that one has to really remember that erasures occur in many different ways. Sometimes it's at the macro level, and sometimes it's at the very, very macro level. But both are relevant in that sense. So what Purnima was saying in terms of the creativity or the artists and the fetishes of the naming, and one of the things as an art historian, what I've often thought about is that what people don't realize when they look at the Indian art history is that we privilege when there is a name, but we actually don't privilege those that don't have a name associated with it. However, within the context of the time, people knew, so that the pattern weavers, we might not know their names, but everybody knew that if you got those two weavers, they were the best. They knew that. They didn't have to name them. It wasn't inscribed. But then you have to go to something else to actually recover that knowledge. So that, for example, Goswami's work on Pahari painters, it all came from pandas in Varanasi. It didn't come from the names that were written necessarily on the manuscript. So we almost have to think about how to excavate the kind of way that we know what we know. And it's not always in a straight line.
Yeah, I mean,
if I can just interrupt for a moment before we end, Vishakha made a very important point about the norm that we tend to think of Akbar as an exception. And, we all do, Madhusudana Saraswati in Akbar's court with the Totapuris and Arindam Chakraborty's work on Muslim philosophy. All Akbar is an exception. I don't know whether Vishakha was correct or not. And I really wanted you to address that you show that it was actually the norm and we don't need to exceptionalize Akbar all the time. Sorry for interrupting, but carry on.
Yeah, exactly.
I think I know we're almost out of time. I just want to just reinscribe some of the things that Purnima as well as Aisha have already mentioned beautifully, which is this ideas of kind of normative ways of writing history that elide the worker or fetishize the object, or takes Europe's own conventional historiography and erases it in order to prioritize the 19th century version or the 20th century version. And what we need to do, or we here as some of us who work in pre-18th or pre-19th century, is to kind of resist the smoothness with which we can also do the same elision, and in fact to kind of bring it back in. So one of the things that I struggle with when I was going through copy edits was all those lists that I produced in the book, and I was like, anyone going to read these lists of names? Like, what am I doing? And then, but I kept saying, like, I can't take them out because that's the point of it, right? I want to make that encounter reinvigorated for the reader. So thank you for those comments. And I think Vishakha, to your point about like knowing that is not inscribed or not instilled in a kind of inscriptive domain, and thus not recoverable, I think also forces us to rethink our habits of authorial, if not primary functions that we assign to, something like a tangible world making, right? And I think I know I'm not unique in saying this, but even from listening to my grandmother and my mother think about particular crafts and arts related to their families and where they come from, and how they maintain a memory of the families that worked on those particular fabrics or textiles or copperware. I remember all these names of families being read out to me, like when we, most recently, my mother talking about her putative granddaughter's future marriage and what particular family must make the lenga, and it can only be that family. And I was like, Amma, do they even make lengas anymore? She's like, I have no idea. But like that's the sort of world.
I was just going to say it's more like the gharana that's in the
musical
craft making tradition, as is in music or dance, what have you. But we forget those kinds of collective memories that exist. But I think the question that Gayatri picked up, it will be interesting, Manan, if you agree with me that we've so exceptionalized Akbar that we are actually not looking at it as a more normative behavior. Am I right in saying that?
I mean, there's obviously.
I mean, it's a little overstatement, but I do
great
feel like.
Yeah. I think Akbar's exceptionalism has been challenged or successfully shown that they're Jahangir and Babur and Man Singh and a whole host of other figures in the Mughal North India and are participating in some of the practices that Akbar is valorized for by the colonial historiography. And I mean, Purnima's work and Rajiv Kinra, and there's so many other people who have kind of successfully shown, ways of thinking that are legible, but the model remains. I mean, I think the Akbar and Aurangzeb remain dyads for better or for worse to this day.
I mean, maybe, Manan, it's worth pointing out how much we owe that to colonial historiography too, because precisely because the moment of the Jesuits at Akbar's court is so hugely valorized in the kind of European sort of history from the late 16th century onward in multiple languages, right? And so we get like the surprise, Akbar, who is maybe not the despot, and then wait, there's Aurangzeb and he's the despot, and he's like, they fit the model of the kind of European vision of the Turk and the Arab, right? And so there is a sense in which that dyad is itself, produces a kind of conceptual framing within colonial historiography that gets imported backward, right? So I kind of like that exists, I think, outside of the world of, Mughal historians who have been challenging that now for some time. There's still, I think, the sense beyond that, we are reflecting still on 400 years of that construction.
Yeah, absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. You're absolutely right.
But I think partly, Manan, to me, what was interesting is that in a non-Mughal world and pre-Mughal world, where this interactivity was also evident, so that it was not something that came out of nowhere. And that's partly sort of how one might think about Akbar too.
Okay, I think we better wrap it up. We're out of time. We did have a couple of questions that came and disappeared early on that I'm sorry if people didn't hear them, but anyway, yes, let's thank you all for an excellent discussion. This has been really stimulating and for a really path-breaking book. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. I want to thank Kathy and Purnima, Aisha and Vishakha and everyone else who visited. I'm really so very grateful for your time and for your labor today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.